research?
You know, I have a preference myself for learning history through historic fiction. And when my husband and I bought Mike Stufflebean, at that time, he's passed away, but when we bought the inn in 2000 at auction, talk about an impulse buy, we decided that I love history, and we decided that we needed to have a book, something that could be sold in the gift shop that would tell people about the significance of not just the inn, but the significance of the people that settled in Mission Valley, the sages that came here and had the inn built. The reason I bring up about historic fiction is that, you know, this was never intended to be a footnoted thesis. It was a book for guests. But little did I know, I wound up having a lot of locals that like the book. And because they're for sale on Amazon, I've had even a lot of sage ancestry by the book from England. So, you know, it's turned out to be more popular than what I thought it would be. Historic fiction gives you the ability to then tell a story, and everybody loves a good story. And so I tell in this book a lot of the historical research that I did through letters that may or may not exist, through first-person dialogue between characters when there was no person there to witness it. But as much as possible, because like I said, I am an academe, my historical facts are accurate, and I do have a reference sheet in the back. So let's get started. This book is about a love story between Alfred Sage and two women named Mary Ann. So Mary Ann Bassett was his first wife. Mary Ann Dennett was his second wife. And so the book is written in such a way that they each tell their story about coming to Kansas in first person. When they die, he whispers, "Good night, Mary Ann." And then his death I will tell you about in the epilogue at the end when I'm reading a little bit more information. In 1848, four adventurous sage brothers, Arthur, John, Alfred, and Mark, arrived in America from Somersetshire, England. Alfred Sage was 15 years old. In 1849, the Bassett family immigrated from Glastonbury, England. Among them were two daughters, Mary Ann, who married Alfred Sage, and Elizabeth, who married John Sage. Both marriages were in 1854. In 1855, they caravanned to Iowa City. It was here in Iowa City in the early 1856 that John Sage was introduced to General James Lane with the Kansas militia. He was recruiting people who were sympathetic to the cause of having the Kansas Territory admitted to the Union as a free state. The Iowa City newspaper reported that Lane's militia had built stone chimneys along a trail leading folks from Iowa City to Mount Pleasant and then across the bottom of the state going west to Civil Bend, a village where they would gather and be joined by a guide. It'd take a day for a wagon to go across, so they literally had encampments on both sides of Civil Bend, or of the river there in Civil Bend. John and Alfred Sage and their wives decided they would head west. Now, the enticement may be originally that Kansas was selling land for $1.25 an acre. But I have a feeling that after meeting John Brown and the fervor of his abolition cause, they were soon converted. They met him in person July 4th, 1856. John Brown told a bushwhacker sacking Lawrence. Two of his sons, John Jr. and Jason, were captured and imprisoned at Camp Sackett near Lecompton. Brown had brought Colonel Eldridge, now think Eldridge Hotel, in Lawrence, to be their guide and to help get them into Kansas territory. North Kansas Highway 75 that goes from Nebraska City through Holton and down to Topeka is pretty much the last leg of that Lane Trail. And then they arrived in North Topeka at Papin's Landing, where they had to take a ferry, which was logs roped together, to get the wagon on across into Topeka. The wife stayed in Chase's boarding house while Alfred and John set out southwest to claim their land. A military road went to Indianola, near the Baptist Mission. The rolling hills near Mission Creek were as beautiful as their homeland near Dover, England. There was plenty of native limestone for building. Mary Ann and Elizabeth's initial concern was living in an area populated by Indians. They built 2 log cabins in the present-day Dover Cemetery site, just south of the Dover Grade School. Nearby was a tribe of Massasoit Indians who lived where the Massasoit empties into Mission Creek. The Kansas Indians predate the naming of Mission Creek when it was called American Chiefs Creek and had their village up here at Echo Cliff. They regularly traveled the Southwest Trail from Council Grove to Topeka. The Shawnee village was at Brownsville, now Auburn, and the Pottawatomie had a trading post and pay station at Uniontown. So you can see they were right in the heart of Indian country here in Kansas. Mary Ann Sage was already with child, giving birth in the fall of 1856, a son, William Henry Bassett Sage. So it was scary for her and Elizabeth because they knew that Alfred and John had pledged to respond to carry arms if called by James Brown or John Brown or James Lane. A courier from the Kansas militia arrived in August carrying a note penned by Lane requesting that they follow him to Council City, which is Burlingame, and then traversed easterly to the banks of the Meridocene to aid John Brown at Osawatomie. All available militia were with Lane, rescuing Dr. Robinson, the Free State leader, from the jail at Lecompton. Unfortunately, many free soilers, like the Sages, were also very inexperienced in warfare. They'd open fire on the border ruffians before they were even in range, and their horses were skittish because of the noisy firearms. As a result, Osawatomie burned August 30th, 1856. John Brown was wounded and his son Fred was killed. John Brown narrowly escaped capture and rode on to Nebraska City. The year 1857 brought people from the north by the droves. James Bassett, Mary Ann and Elizabeth's brother, arrived in February of 1857. Topeka grew to over 450 people that spring. The Sage brothers and their brother-in-law worked the land diligently, and the bounty was quite a haul that first summer. Their diary stated that they had sugar cane, 10 feet tall, corn that touched the sky, vines grew like a jungle with plenty of beans, melons, squash, pumpkins, and there was wild turkey everywhere. The richness of the claims in the valley and an outbreak of smallpox in Topeka drove many settlers towards the valley along Mission Creek. Mark, the youngest Sage brother, and his wife Josephine joined the two couples in July of 1857. Their decision to come was most welcomed with so many supplies having been depleted. Mark purchased oxen and a wagon full of fresh supplies and farming implements. Alfred and John were concerned about the trip, since this was the same time that Connecticut preacher Henry Ward Beecher was shipping Sharp's rifles as contraband concealed by Bibles to a church in Wabansie. But Mark was described as this big, burly guy, which would cause most men to think twice before confronting him. Indeed, Mark's physical presence served him well, since for a period of time when he got here, he transported grain to Denver and Taos, driving 16 oxen and wagons under contract for the government. Corn could be sold in Leavenworth for $1 a bushel, but it sold for $1 a pound in Denver. Mark Sage and James Bassett did the government grain transport together until James heard that gold had been panned near Pikes Peak. The bachelor moved on to seek his fortune, and that's exactly what happened in 1859. James Bassett worked a claim that yielded $500,000 in gold. He then met back up with Mark delivering in Denver, and the two returned with enough money to do their own homesteading in Mission Valley. Meanwhile, let's keep things in chronological order by returning to the sacking of Lawrence as told by John Brown to the Sages on the Lane Trail in 1856. Because there was another person important to the history of the Sage Inn who came to Kansas before Alfred Sage and his wife, Mary Ann Bassett. And that was his second wife, Mary Ann Dennett. Mary Ann was the daughter of Quakers from Pennsylvania who came to settle in Lawrence with the Immigrant Aid Society. She was a descendant of the William Penn Colony of Pennsylvania. She and her family were incentivized to live in Kansas Territory because of their conviction to abolish slavery. They were living in Lawrence when the border ruffians attacked the night that he was talking about. Mary Ann's then husband was a picket or a lookout on the Wakarusa River, and he was killed that night. Her parents took her two sons and fled with them to Big Springs. Mary Ann stayed behind, and contrary to everything she had been taught as a Quaker, she used a rifle to guard their homestead. Mary Ann's father, Daniel Sayre, returned the following day to search for her. Finding their cabin intact, his daughter was inside and had hidden others whose cabins had burned. She and her father escaped to Big Springs, where a Shawnee Indian scout spied them and shepherded them to a bend on the Shunganunga Creek. From there, they were told to follow the creek to Topeka. By fall, the family had dug a cave along the shoulder of the Shunganunga. Daniel Sayre had been a stonemason in Pennsylvania. He scavenged the rubble left from a limestone quarry to shore up the walls of the cave for the winter. Well, the quarry was on the farm of John Ritchie. When Sayre approached Ritchie about doing any masonry work, Ritchie was thrilled to learn of Sayre's ability to cut limestone blocks, which were in high demand in the growing town of Topeka. The outbreak of smallpox that I mentioned earlier in 1858 led the Sayre family to move west then to Mission Valley, and they made their home near Keene between Dover and Eskridge. But Daniel Sayre continued for a long time to work as a stonemason in and around Topeka. Shortly before the time of John Brown's death on December 2nd, 1859, when he was hung after being captured at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, Brown had freed 11 Negroes outside of Fort Scott near the Missouri line. They fled along the Pottawatomie Creek. A network of homesteaders living near creeks going to the northwest formed an underground railroad for just such an event to harbor refugees and move them closer to the Lane Trail and north to Canada. For instance, Captain William Beach, here in Mission Valley, was from Canada and thought to be involved in this activity, as was his son, Dr. Samuel Beach. The Sayers that I just talked about were abolitionists from Philadelphia, and they also had that connection with John Ritchie. Henry Harvey was a Quaker missionary to the Osage Indians on Dragoon Creek, and of course is who Harveyville is named after. Jehu Hodgson, Harvey Loomis, Alf Sage, all of these guys were thought to have been involved. A drought in 1860 brought only 4 inches of rain. The land of milk and honey had dried up and disaster relief was requested for the Kansas Territory. In November, Abraham Lincoln was elected president, and upon taking office in 1861, shots were fired at Fort Sumter. Lincoln called his military to arms. The 2nd Kansas Cavalry Company F was formed and included James Bassett, who became the lieutenant colonel of that company, and Mary Ann Dennett's 2 sons, James and Squire. Under orders of General Curtis, their unit was sent into battle with the Confederates at Pea Ridge in Arkansas. Both of Mary Ann Dennett's sons were wounded in the war. Squire had a leg amputated. He suffered what we know to be post-traumatic stress and later committed suicide after his brother James died from a saber thrust into his chest. Both of those Dennett soldiers are buried in the Keene Cemetery. Alfred built a store in proximity or perhaps in the footprint of this Sommerset Hall. Brother Mark had homesteaded near Halifax, which was past Keene but going straight, and instead of turning on the highway to go to Eskridge, you just keep going like you'd be headed towards Alma. It was close to the stage station that Mark Sage had built for John Copp, and where Mark worked alongside of John Copp. That station was later burned in a tragic fire that killed all 4 Copp children who were asleep upstairs. The sorrow pushed the Copps to start over in Paxico. I might add they found a dead body in the remains of that fire as well from some earlier time. Side note. Anyway, Mary Ann Sage talked Alfred into donating their very first log cabin, which was that one built in the cemetery over at the cemetery, for a schoolhouse. She found a schoolmistress to teach their 4 children along with other area youngsters. Isabel Smith was hired. She later married Thomas Haskell. On December 19th of 1863, Mary Ann Bassett Sage died, giving birth to her 5th child, a son who was born breech. I think grief causes people to do strange things. At least it sounded strange to me that 2 weeks after his wife Mary Ann died, Alfred enlisted in the Civil War and took part in Price's raid near Kansas City. That must mean that the 5 children under the age of 8 were no doubt cared for by his sister-in-laws. Now, Mary Ann Dennett, who had moved over here at Keene, she was 15 years older than Alfred, but he only outlived her by 5 years. She also had been a friend of Mary Ann Bassett, his wife. Certainly, their abolitionist cause bonded them together as allies, and now grief. Mary Ann was all too familiar with grief, and knowing that Alfred Sage was left with 5 little children who needed a mother, pulled at her heartstrings. And so Alfred Sage married Mary Ann Dennett, on July 23rd of 1864. Arthur Sage, you may recall, was one of the original four Sage brothers who immigrated together at the beginning of this tale. He and his family never left Iowa City until 1866. It wasn't until they arrived in Dover that wealthy bachelor, James Bassett, decided to hang it up as a bachelor and married Arthur's daughter, Anne Sage. The oldest stone house in the Dover area is the one on the west side of Mission Creek. It was deeded by Alfred Sage to his younger brother, Aaron Sage, in 1866, who had been back east fighting in the Civil War. In all likelihood, Alfred lived in that house while building the original, the north side of the present building. And it had to have happened sometime between the years of 1856 and 1866. Alfred Sage had determined he had the perfect location for expansion for the loss of the cop station, since his store and home were both located here on the bend of Mission Creek. The store was already receiving telegrams. It only made sense to be the drop for the area mail. Alfred became the first Dover postmaster. Topeka was a day's journey by stage, which was slower than riding on horseback. So the plans were made to add on a layover station on the south side. Guests could spend the night in one of the rooms upstairs, and then horses could be rested and traded for fresh stock. In the summer of 1867, Mark Sage brought Mary Ann's father, Daniel Sayre, home for the last time to Dover. They had been working on the Capitol building in Topeka when Sayre fell from the scaffolding and died. His funeral was held at the Sage Inn. In 1868, Alfred Sage sold the store to Harvey Loomis. At that time, Alfred owned 335 acres of land, a barn that was 40 foot square, cattle stables, granary, the grist mill, the inn, raised sheep for wool, pigs for meat, and had 100 to 200 heads of cattle most of the time. And yet he still continued to also build. He was determined to build Granny Sayre. That was Mark Sayre's. Mark Sayre? James Sayre. That was his. Sorry, that was Mary Ann's mother. Her own house, a house that her husband had been promising her for a long time. And I think it's the stone house north of the inn on the corner, since what I found was that Granny Sayre walked back and forth half a mile to and from every day to the inn and did all the cooking in the Sage Inn. Daniel Sayre, got it. You might enjoy her scones recipe made with minced fresh sage and raisins, and the recipe is found, yes, in the book. In the early 1870s, 3 million buffalo were slaughtered for profit. Each buffalo brought $3 a head. Large herds that were once in the west part of Mission Creek Valley became extinct, and as a result, all of the Indian tribes moved on. Perhaps a just irony, in 1874, the Lord sent a plague equal to anything seen by the people of Egypt. Chinch bugs wiped out the wheat fields, grasshoppers and locusts killed everything else, fruit trees, cornfields, everything. About midday, hordes of winged creatures would move in like a dark storm cloud. The plague wiped out Harvey Loomis's business here at the Mercantile. Alfred Sage, though, reopened it for distribution of government relief. Shawnee County sold bonds to raise money for the farmers. Arthur Sage and Harvey Loomis then went into business together running a cheese factory here in Dover. John and Elizabeth Sage moved after the plague closer to Topeka, near 10th and Gerald, a block west of Wanamaker, where only a small little stone building is left from that original farm. And John and Mark built a commercial building for their masonry business in the first block of Kansas Avenue by the river. Mark did remain in Mission Valley, but was well known for building stone churches such as in Maple Hill and North Topeka. He and John were the builders of Dr. Crane's house at the historic Topeka Cemetery, and we know this because they were often known for using arches above the windows, like the arches you would see found on stone bridges. That's one reason why I think Alfred Sage was the primary builder on the Sage Inn, because the arches are missing. Throughout the 1870s, before the railroad was accessible to small towns, the stagecoach was still the primary means of transportation for most of Kansas. The Root Brothers transfer of Wichita had an eastern terminus at Emporia, which was also the western terminus for the Southwestern Stage Company. In 1878, the Root Brothers transfer of Wichita bought the Southwestern Stage Company, which had its beginnings covering the Southwest Trail, which was a crossover trail, but originating at Uniontown, going through Dover and connecting with Harveyville to the Santa Fe Trail. That's why they called it a crossover trail. This expansion was a big boon for the Sage Inn and Layover Station. In 1878, the Sages contracted with Root Brothers Transfer for a minimum of 5 years, renewable at the end of each period. The Sage Inn and Layover Station expanded to 3,000 square feet. The first door, the oldest part of the structure, rented rooms upstairs and was the family business with a kitchen below. The second door, the middle, was for all stage business. I remember how worn the floorboards were on the front part of that stage station, so I was very glad when subsequent owners remodeled it to a modern kitchen that they left those exposed. We used to hang old firearms on the walls of the station to signify that we were keepers of the peace. Below the station, that middle part, was Alfred and Mary Ann's bedroom. The third door, which is the south one on this side, was for dining, and the area under the dining was never finished but housed animals. An excellent plaster craftsman moved to Dover in 1873. His name was Harry Perkins, who added the decorative ceiling medallions, which may have served as his salesman samples for businessmen in Topeka to come and view. Alfred did the same when John Scott moved to Dover in 1883. John was a stonemason with special abilities with the rock saw. He could take a long piece of stone and cut it so precisely it gave it a sawtooth design. Alfred had the south window on the dining room removed and a bay window installed using this technique for the cornice. The inn has many unique features, and one bathroom used to have a 7-foot copper soaking tub. It did have, until one of my guests decided that both she and her husband should use it on their honeymoon, and that broke the seams. We tried to find someone who could mend the copper, but it was just too old and nobody was willing to do it. I wonder if that tub is still in the garage where we left it as a keepsake. It is? Researching this book piqued my curiosity as to whether I could find any archaeological evidence to support all this history. I tore off some boards covering what I thought was an old well out back, but found a stone room in the ground. situated behind the southwest corner of the original homestead. Clearly, it had not been a well, but possibly could have been cold storage or a root cellar. Whether there could be any tie to the Underground Railroad is hard to prove. Alfred and Mary Ann Sage fit the profile of those who were active in the movement. They owned land on both sides of Mission Creek at this location, and the Underground Railroad was operational during those same years. What has been difficult is proving exactly when the stone houses on each side of Mission Creek were built, or even if log cabins may predate them. Then it's very possible that the underground room could have been used to harbor slaves, because it was also a very short path through the trees to Mission Creek. I discovered broken dishes, tin utensils, arrowheads, iron tools, wagon parts. The collection of things were displayed on a tray for guests at the inn and people who toured to look through. When the inn was sold, these things were left with the dwelling. I hope these are still apart.
Not sugar.
Okay. In closing, I will read to you now about Alfred Sage's death in 1905. Alfred Sage lived 5 years into the new century, which were the first in over 45 years without a Mary Ann at his side. He continued doing business in Dover until his death. He operated the Sage Inn and Sommerset Hall across from the inn. The Oddfellows, including Alfred Sage, began their fraternal brotherhood upstairs in this store. Aaron Sage and his 2 sons, George and Fred, fiddled for dances on Saturday nights on the top floor of Sommerset Hall. The building became the heartbeat of the community and continues to be to this day. Most folks referred to it simply as Sage Hall. Alfred never missed a dance, choosing to sit in a chair, often with his eyes closed, smiling and remembering. Finally, I want you to hear what the local paper said about Alfred. No man could have a better friend than he. No worthy man, however poor, ever went to him for a favor that he did not get it. He was kind-hearted to an extreme degree and sympathetic.
Yeah.
He was hospitable. The sorrows and misfortunes of his fellow men troubled him deeply and brought forth a ready and generous response. He was plain, without deceit or pretensions. Alf Sage will certainly be rewarded in the life to come. He accumulated much of the world's goods and the affections of all who knew him. I want you to know, I think it was an honor to be caretaker.
If any of you were ever able to come out and have dinner with us, you remember a big buffet here in the middle with fried chicken and running out of pie. During the time that we owned the cafe, it had been closed prior to that and was in pretty bad shape. We had to do about 3 months worth of renovations before we could open. But we did some renovations and opened up the store, and we tried to keep it as authentic as we could. I still had the front desk that Tom Scott, when I was a girl, then ran the little store here. It wasn't a cafe then, it was a store. And it didn't carry a whole lot of stuff, but it carried the essentials. And I grew up here in Dover, lived here all my life. I'm one of the few people that it says Dover on my birth certificate. I was born at home. My father owned this little filling station right over here across the road. And I took piano lessons down the road here on Wednesday evenings, and I would walk down to the filling station to ride home with my dad. Now, in 1960s, early 60s, little girls didn't hang out at a filling station.
Quick.
That just wasn't proper, you know, and my dad didn't want me to hear what those men in that station were talking about. And he didn't want me to hear their language. So he would send me over here to Tom's. And Tom had a bench up there in front of that front window, and I would sit up there and wait for Dad to be done at the filling station. He closed at the same time Tom did. So Dad would give me a nickel, and I'd come over and I could either get a pop. There was a pop machine set right out in the middle of the floor here. And I was telling my sister a little while ago, when we bought the place, my brother went down in the basement, which is a dirt floor, rock walls. We called it the place people go and never come back. And there were a few mounds down there. I never dug around on one. But Tom had cut a little hole in the floor so he didn't have to empty the pop tops. And it went straight through. And there was a mound down there about that tall of pop tops. All kinds. But anyhow, I have a lot of memories of this store when I was a girl. One of the memories I have is that Tom Scott never closed the store before 6 o'clock. We lived 6 miles south, and even after I got older and I was driving, my mother would say, "Run down to Tom's and get me a butt of bologna and a loaf of bread, but you gotta hurry along because he's gonna be closing in 20 minutes. He never closed early. And when I owned the cafe, the girls would say, "It's pretty dead this afternoon, why don't we go ahead and close up?" And I said, "No, Tom would have never closed early." So I stayed till I said I would. Tom taught me a good lesson. One of the other places I got to go, though, when the men at the filling station's language wasn't quite right, dear Mrs. Boker that lived in the Sage Inn, Eva Boker, she was an elderly woman, lived there by herself when I was growing up. And Eva would step out on that front porch and she would motion to me. And I'd go over and she'd say, "Go tell your dad you're gonna stay with me till it's time to go home." She didn't want me over at that filling station either. This made me quite angry because, you know, my younger brothers could pump gas. I wasn't allowed to pump gas because I was a girl. But Mrs. Boker would take me into the inn and we would sit in the parlor and we would have tea and cookies. And she taught me how to hold my cup and my saucer on my knees and to drink it and hold on to that saucer and to use my napkin and to be quite the little lady when I was in her parlor. And I enjoyed the inn so much as a child and thought it was so beautiful. And the last time I was in the inn was when Deborah would allow people to come and tour during Heritage Days. Lots of memories there, Deborah. Thank you. But when we opened the cafe, we had quite the fun here. I always used to go and open the door for people to come in, and I'd say, "Come on in and join the fun," because that's what it was. Nobody should have had that much fun working. But it was a lot of fun. We were blessed to have sweet Norma Grubb. Lived up the road here, 2 houses from the little creek here. And she had lived in Dover, since maybe the mid-60s. And Norma had baked pies here for the store prior to that, but she baked them at home. Well, then when the health department stepped in and they said, "Can't do that anymore," Norma had to come down here to bake the pies. Well, every morning I got here about 5:30. We asked Norma when we started the cafe if she wanted to bake pies for us. And Norma said, "Well, sure, I'd like a little money to get my hair done every week." And she didn't regard it as a huge job. Well, that changed. But dear Norma, I would go up at 6 o'clock. I would go up at 6 o'clock and pick up Norma and bring her down, and she would bake her pies, and she was usually done by about 9. Well, then someone, dear Janet Sage, one of my cousins and a relative of Alfred Sage, she nominated Norma, unbeknownst to us, to ABC's Good Morning America. Well, I had been to a wedding in Topeka for one of the Brennan girls, and I was coming back and I was stopping. I came back home to stop here and close up for the day. And when I came in, they said, Connie, you have a phone call. And I took the phone, and there was this guy on the phone telling me, I'm with Good Morning America, and she's a finalist. I said, who's a finalist? How much is this going to cost me? I thought, we got somebody on the phone. I need to be just hanging up for him, And he said, no, Norma was nominated for the best slice of America. I said, the what? I said, I don't know what you're talking about. And he said, don't you watch Good Morning America? And I said, no, I'm at work at 5:30 every morning. I don't watch Good Morning America. And so he said, well, she's a finalist, and I'll call you in 1 week and let you know when we're going to be there. I said, when you're going to be here? What are you talking about? So, anyhow, I went up and I went up to Norma's house, and I said, Norma, do you know anything about this? She said, well, some guy called me. Said I was a finalist in a pie contest, but I didn't enter any pie contest, Connie. I said, okay, well, we'll wait and see what happens. He's supposed to call back next week. Well, on Saturday I was cooking, and it was my Saturday to be on the grill, and the girls came and said, this guy's on the phone for me from New York. I said, from New York? What are you talking about? So anyhow, I went to the phone, and he said, well, she's one of 4 finalists, or 3 or 4. And I said, so what's that mean? And he said, well, it means we're going to come and film her to be on Good Morning America on ABC. And I said, well, when are you coming? Well, they're coming next week. So I went up and talked to Norma about it, and I called him back, and I said, well, she says that's all right. So anyhow, he said, we'll be there next Thursday. Well, Thursday we have our lunch buffet, and I said, yeah, you're welcome, but we're going to be open. And he said, well, we'll have a film crew, and we want Norma to bake a pie for us. And Marisol Castro, who was worked for ABC at that time, Good Morning America, will be with us. Well, in walked this little bitty gal about this tall, and a film crew, and they set up. Norma stood here at the bar and made a pie, and showed Marisol how to make pie crust, and she rolled out pie crust, and we had a lot of fun. And then they wanted to know if I could send them with 4 pies back to New York. I said, coconut cream? I said, you got to be kidding me. That doesn't travel very well. And they said, well, we're going to take them on the plane. So we boxed up 4 coconut cream pies, and they took them on the plane. Well, this was in November, early December. The following week, they aired, every day they aired one of the clips from being at these 4 different places around the United States. And I think I finally realized it was for real. I thought it was some kind of a hoax at first. I really did. But anyhow, they called me, and they said on Saturday morning, and they said, she won. What? I said, she what? They said, she won. And we will be at your cafe at 5:30 tomorrow morning to film. There will be a film crew there, and we want you to have a crowd so that all these people can see Norma being greeted. I said, and you need to decorate, put up balloons, and have pie, and didn't know what to do. Called my sister-in-law, who was the owner of the store. I said, go to town, get balloons, get signage. I started calling some of our favorite customers, and they started spreading the word, and we had 63 people here at 5:30 in the morning. And I got here at about 4:30 and baked some cinnamon rolls so we'd have something for them to eat. And Norma had pie sitting out here. We took Norma, we didn't want to tell Norma she won. But how else can we get her here at 5:30 on a Sunday morning? So we took Norma down to the beauty shop on Saturday afternoon at Penny's, and said, Norma needs her hair done. She's going to be on national TV tomorrow morning. And Norma said, oh my God, are they coming back?
That's right.
Needless to say, she was on Good Morning America, had a great time. It was such a privilege for that dear, sweet little woman to get this kind of an honor. But what happened was called a deluge. And everybody wanted coconut cream pie for Christmas. Norma baked 93 coconut cream pies, and they went out in one day. She baked them over a 2-day period. We did all the crusts one day, and then she filled them all and topped them the next day, and 93 pies went out. That was just the start, though. On a daily basis, people walked in and didn't just want a piece of pie, they wanted the whole pie. And Norma got to where she was baking between 20 and 30 a day, coconut cream. I was baking all the fruit pies and anything else, chocolate. Norma made the coconut cream, and they sold out every day. Every new business should have a Norma. Because let me tell you, it changed from being a little local diner to people walking in here and looking around saying, I don't know anybody in here. Is there any place to sit? And it was just such a shock for this little community. And that went on for a year. I mean, it didn't slow down. She got a little book and put it up here, and we had people from all 50 states and 7 foreign countries come here to eat Norma's pie. The Bike Across America changed their route so they could come here and eat pie. We had quite the time, but it was a wonderful opportunity for us as the owners of the cafe. And when we lost Norma, we lost a gem. But she told me right before she died, I'll tell you a cute story. We went up to the hospital to see her, and she said, will you make me a promise? She was kind of blunt. And I said, well, sure, Norma, what can I do for you? And she said, promise me you'll always make my recipe for coconut cream. I said, yep, that's not hard. I'll make your recipe for coconut cream. So anyhow, we set out to hire a new pie baker, which was very hard. And this dear sweet lady, Bernita Schultz, came walking in the door, and she said, I'm a good pie baker. I said, I'll bet you are. She said, I used to own a shop in St. Mary's, Kansas, and made a lot of pie there, a lot of cinnamon rolls, breads, different things. And she said, I'd like to be your pie baker. And I said, well, I would love to have you. You can make any pie you want except coconut cream, and we have to make Norma's recipe. I made her a deathbed promise that we would make her pie. And she said, oh, I can't do that. She said, I only make my own recipes. She said, I don't copy anybody else. And I said, well, I'm not asking you to copy anybody on anything but the coconut cream. She said, well, I can't do it. She said, I'll bake you a pie. And I said, no, don't do that, because I said, if you can't make Norma's recipe, I can't do it. I made a promise, and I'm going to keep it. So Bernita went home, and about 3 hours later, she showed up with a pie. Now, you eat my pie, and you tell me if you don't think it's better than hers, she said. I said, no, I'm not judging pie. I'm not judging pie. I said, I'm sure it's wonderful, but I said, I'm not judging pie. I said, we got to make Norma's recipe. Well, it took Bernita about 2 weeks. She called me and she said, I want to bake pies. I'll make her recipe. I said, oh, I welcome you, because I'm tired of doing this myself. And Bernita walked in the door, and I handed her Norma's recipe, and she looked at it and she goes, that's exactly like mine. We just spent about 3 weeks arguing about making Norma's pie, and it was the exact same recipe, to the pinch of salt. We enjoyed being in business here in Dover, and if any of you were ever able to come out and join us, I know that we enjoyed every customer that walked in the door, and I always enjoy coming back. This is the John Deere table, yeah. There's Massey Ferguson table around here too. When you're in farm community, you cater to the farmers. We enjoyed being here today, and I thank you for letting me speak to you. This building is quite an architectural wonder itself. This is called, for you fellas and ladies that know, this is a balloon structure. That means the 2x4s go all the way from the floor to the roof. They're one piece. We did not cut holes in these walls because of that. We had to get special permission to cut that hole in the kitchen to put in the fan going out. But they limited us on how many we could cut and still have the integrity of the building and keep them. When you go upstairs, I want you all to be sure and notice the woodwork. It is still original up there. And it's so cool to see. There's an ante room where they used to hang their coats. There was a kitchen, and it's been somewhat remodeled, but the rest of the upstairs is very much itself. I remember going to sock hops up there when I was a kid and playing bingo up there. But the stairs were quite the problem even back then. So I hope you enjoy the tour up there because it's one of my favorite places. There's a third floor, but it has lots of wasps.
Thanks.
But okay, thank you so much.
Here, please.
Thank you. Great job.